Hey, U.S. history students. Today we're going to start talking about a new era or period in U.S. history called the era of imperialism or expansionism. And we're going to start with a war called the Spanish-American War. And this war was a short little war, relatively short, about 6 months, but it had a big impact on U.S. foreign policy and a big impact and a big turning point in how the U.S. is seen around the world and how the United States feels about itself. All right, the Spanish-American War basically starts with Cuba. Cuba is controlled by Spain, and as you may know, Cuba is very close to the United States. It's only about 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Well, the Cubans wanted their independence, and they declared independence from Spain in 1895. Obviously, Spain is not happy about this. They don't want to lose their territory, their Cuban territory, and so they send forces in to try to shut down the rebellion, to try to force Cubans to stay under their rule. They did use some brutal methods. They forced entire villages, even innocent women and children, etc., into prison camps, and these prison camps were not very nice places. A lot of them died. And a lot of American newspapers, which is how most Americans got their news during this time period, there was no TV, radio, it was newspapers. They sent reporters down to Cuba to report on what's going on, and you had newspapers such as the New York World, the New York Journal, and these newspapers basically sensationalized what was going on. They reported what was going on, but they added a little flair to it. They embellished it. They made it seem worse than it was. They depicted the Spaniards as murderous brutes, and they tried to make it seem really bad so they could sell more papers. People like to read things that are really bad, and so they wanted to sell a lot of papers. That's called yellow journalism. So it's basically unbalanced and very biased reporting in order to sell newspapers. That's the goal. Here's an example of that type of journalism, yellow journalism. You've got here they're reporting that Spaniards are searching women on American steamers, and they're basically strip searching women, and so a lot of Americans are outraged that the Spaniards would stop American ships and search our women. So the yellow journalism leads up to war. But there are a few triggering events that you need to know as to why the U.S. actually got involved. The first one being a letter by Delome, who is the Spanish ambassador to the United States. So he's in the United States, and he writes a letter back home to Spain calling our president at the time, President McKinley, weak. And so a lot of people are outraged that this Spanish ambassador would be so bold as to call our president weak. And American newspapers get a hold of this letter and they publish it in the newspapers, and so it's out there, and so there's some resentment and hatred towards Spain. And then shortly after that, the United States sends a warship, the USS Maine, to Cuba to sit in Havana Harbor and protect American lives and property that are going on there, because there's a war going on, there's a revolt going on. The president wants to secure American interests, economic interests, etc. So he sends a warship. While that warship is sitting in Havana Harbor, it explodes, killing 258 U.S. sailors. Now, the cause of the explosion is unknown, and today most people believe that it was a mechanical failure, it was an accident. But the U.S. papers were quick to blame the Spanish, that yellow journalism again. They're trying to sell papers. And so all these protests were set off in America, and most Americans wanted to go to war with Spain. So they call our president weak. They're putting these people into terrible concentration camps, the Cubans into concentration camps, and now they've blown up a warship. And so most Americans are calling for war. Here's a newspaper from that period. So you've got Maine explosion caused by bomb or torpedo. Here you've got a newspaper saying that destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. So they're blaming the Spanish. Here's a drawing, a depiction of the explosion of the USS Maine. All right, the war was relatively quick. It was fought in two fronts. It was fought over in the Pacific, over here, and it was also fought in the Caribbean. Now, the first thing the United States did once war was declared was a fleet was sent a U.S. fleet was sent to take the Philippines. And so the Navy goes in, they defeat the Spanish at Manila Bay in the Philippines and take control of the Philippines. Then the focus is on Cuba. And so fighting moves to Cuba. This is where you have Theodore Roosevelt, who would become president. At this point, he's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He raises a force known as the Rough Riders, and they go in this cavalry force, and they defeat the Spanish in Cuba at San Juan Hill. It's an important battle, Battle of San Juan Hill. You've got Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. You've got the Navy attacks Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and they take control of Cuba. And so within 4 months, Spain is defeated, and America takes over the Spanish territory. So now Spanish has now gained all of the Spanish territories out here in the Pacific and Cuba. And so America went from not owning territories overseas to having a big group of islands and other territories that they now own and control. And so this is why America is moving into the period known as imperialism or expansionism, because our territory is expanding and growing. Here is Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders group that helped win the Battle of San Juan Hill and take Cuba. Spanish-American War is known as a turning point. It's called a turning point because basically it's the end of Spain's colonial empire because they lose all of the territory to the United States, and America emerges as a world power. So America, this is the first time that we defeat a major world power at war, other than the British in the Revolutionary War, and we really emerge as a world power, and we demonstrate our Navy and our naval power around the world. And so most historians see the Spanish-American War as a turning point, and America emerging from this point to take a larger role in the world. So the war ends, the U.S. defeats Spain, U.S. takes Spanish possessions, so the U.S. gains the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and now the United States has to decide what to do with these things. There are people in the United States that want to take control of it and use it to help the U.S. become a world power. There are those that say, you know what, we have our roots being colonies, and we didn't like being ruled by someone else, and so therefore we should not control other colonies and territories around the world. And there's these two groups that form, imperialists and anti-imperialists, those that want to expand, imperialists, those that don't, anti-imperialists. And this big fight occurs in the United States between these two groups. And so now we have to decide what to do with these territories. And we're going to be talking over the next few days, should the United States have annexed the Philippines, or should we have given them their independence immediately?